Here we are again with concepts on linguistics. In the first video in the series, we looked at what linguistics is. In the second part, we talked about the contribution of Ferdinand de Saussure. And in this part, we will go to the next step and look at the contributions, primarily the contributions of Noam Chomsky. We will be discussing the traditional approach, linguistic approach, the structural approach, structural grammar, the cognitive approach, deep and surface structures, competence and performance, universal grammar, acceptability and grammaticality, immediate constituent analysis, transformational generative grammar, phrase structure rules, etc. in this video. Let's start with a retrospective look at the beginning of linguistics. As we discussed in the first part, linguistics was in Europe originally called philology, and the earliest scholar to attempt a grammar was perhaps in Europe Plato. Later, he came up with a grammar of Greek language. Aristotle too has worked on it. And again, in similar periods of time, we had in India Panini, Patanjali, etc., working on Sanskrit grammar. Why I bring in these two different languages is that there are few aspects of commonalities. Well, let's look at what were the features of the traditional approach. Traditional approach is approach before the late 19th century in Europe. In the traditional approach, the focus was largely on or totally on written texts. And written text means written text, the text written by great writers or very high literature was models. And the grammarians were interested only in high standard language. Any variation which often occurs in everyday use of language were looked down upon. So they insisted a lot on correctness and the purity of language. And in their approach, in their grammars, they were very prescriptive. They would lay down rules and say, this is how language should be. And their grammars contained a lot of prescriptive rules. And it should be remembered that even as the prescriptive rules were being written down, the ordinary people were speaking language in such a way that many of these rules were violated. So that is one thing we need to remember when we look at prescriptive grammar. Meaning was given a lot of importance in the traditional approach, believing that syntax or grammar followed logically from meaning. So the meaning was given a lot of importance. And just as in India, many languages, including Malayalam, adopted grammatical conventions of Sanskrit. In European linguistic tradition also, it was believed that within Greek and Latin framework, any language can be fixed. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, when a grammar was trying to be created for English language, it was a Latin frame that was used. And it had all the qualities that we discussed so far. Let's see what structural approach is. So, from about late 19th century, with the coming of Ferdinand de Saussure in Europe, with people like Leonard Bloomfield in the USA, there was a totally different approach, which we discussed extensively in the previous video. I'll sum up the aspects of structural approach. To Saussure, language was a system of systems. Here it is. Language was a system of systems, each element deriving significance from its relationship with the other elements in the system. And we looked at these elements, phonology, morphology, syntax, etc. So language was like many other things in life. a system of systems. So that is a basic ideas behind what is called structuralism, a system of systems, each deriving significance from its relationship with the other elements in the system, the bigger system. Well, that was a basic way in which language was looked at by the structuralists. Uh, Very different from the traditional approach, which accepted only very high literature, and that also belonging to Sanskrit or Latin or Greek. I'm bringing in Sanskrit just to give us a more contextual idea, though we are looking primarily at the European tradition. So in Europe, through the experiences in the colonies, the English people, the European colonial masters, were becoming exposed to so many other languages, which so far they looked down upon, including the languages in India, in Africa. But many linguists, philologists from Europe who visited India and other parts of the world began to realize that these languages also were very complex, and they, even those which did not have a script, had a very complex system of grammar. So they began to accept all these languages. So I've used the word living languages to denote languages that are actually being used, unlike Sanskrit or Latin or Greek, traditional classical Greek. And also language varieties were accepted by the structuralists. Language varieties were frowned upon. Only written standard English language was considered uh, good or acceptable by the traditionalists, but the structural approach accepted varieties like dialects, registers, etc. Unlike traditional approach, which was very prescriptive, the structural approach was descriptive, which means it described how language is spoken by people rather than saying this is how language should be spoken. They would say this is the way in which language is spoken rather than creating rules about how language should be spoken. Even today, we have a very traditional way of learning English grammar following texts like the Wren and Martin grammar, where we insist on rules a lot. But we need to remember that in Europe, it changed a lot. Language is something that keeps changing. Grammar also is something that has to keep changing. None of the rules are totally fixed. Now, again, unlike the traditional approach, in structural approach, use of meaning in describing grammatical categorize, uh, they rejected meaning. The traditional approach had meaning in the center, and in the structural approach, they rejected the meaning as a way of describing grammatical categories. Instead, we will look at it in the next slide, where we talk about the structural grammar. In structural grammar, grew from Sochaux's work on long parole, synchrony, diachrony, etc. What structural grammar does is it excludes semantics or the construction of meaning while analyzing individual phonological units of sounds, phonemes, the construction of words, morphemes, and inflections, and syntax, function, and relationship between the essential parts within a sentence. So they would look at all these aspects and excluded semantics. And they employed certain discovery procedures to discover the grammar of languages. So when they come across a totally new language as well, they had a set of discovery procedures to expose the grammar of that language. The problem with the structural grammar was a much more acceptable one in realistic terms than the traditional grammar, but it had its own limitations. We need to remember one thing. We had the traditional approach, now we have the structural approach. The structural approach doesn't totally deny all the precepts of the traditional approach. So we need to understand all kinds of knowledge is evolutionary. Structural grammar is built on the traditional grammar. Several weaknesses of traditional grammar would have been um, solved or ameliorated by the structural grammar. And the structural grammar again had several defects, which was rectified by future outlooks, which includes the cognitive approach to language learning. One problem with structural grammar is that they thought of grammar or language as something existing outside the human mind. They believed it was accepted that it was kind of believed that a person, a child, is born with a very blank mind on which language is inscribed. So languages is something that is that like other habits, language is something that you acquire through exposure. This is partly true, but not totally so. So that is where a very important person comes in. That is Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky brought in what is called the cognitive approach. Well, who was he? In fact, who is he? Because he is still there. He is around 90 years old, about 90, and he is still there. He is an American philosopher who was born in 1928. I would say that we can say that after Saussure left the scene in early 20th century, though his books came to be known after that, and his thought was very strong until mid 20th century. But then on, the most prominent figure in linguistics in the West would be certainly Noam Chomsky. He is the most prominent figure, and his syntactic structures, published in 1957, became a turning point in the area. He went beyond the structural grammar and he with his cognitive theories. So we should remember that he did not kind of destroy or totally annul the precepts of structural grammar. He added to it. He made it richer. He went on to another level. He rejected the behaviorist theories also. Theories predominantly say that language is also a kind of habit formation. Uh, well, um, talking about Chomsky's concepts, one this is one idea that he very fundamental to his teaching, which is his uh, precepts. It is deep structure and surface structure. Uh, well, the structural linguist did not consider the psychological aspects of the speaker of a language. This language was considered kind of independent of the speaker. It was something that belonged to the community. That is true to some extent. So it is language does have a social dimension, which is studied by by sociolinguistics, but it also has a strong psychological aspect because ultimately it is the speaker who produces language. And many speakers come together and language becomes a very dynamic thing. So the psychological aspect of speaker, when we consider that, we find that language has both a surface structure and a deeper structure. A sentence, every utterance can have one surface structure, it could have a different deep structure. So that is one point in which the cognitive approach differed very much from the structural approach. For example, the sentence, these pictures are nice, would be analyzed by the structuralists and they would classify it as a statement. But suppose a friend comes to your home and he sees a picture that you have drawn and he says, these pictures are nice. It could also mean that, could you give me one of your pictures? Can I have one of those? So, hidden behind that statement, there could be a request. So, the surface structure is that of a statement, which is, these pictures are nice. And that on the deeper level, it is a request. It's another kind of sentence. Can I have one of these? Well, that is a very good example for deep structure and the surface structure. And Chomsky looked for a kind of grammatical model that will bring out the deep structures as well as the surface structures of the utterances within a language. He also drew a distinction between competence and performance. This is similar to Lang and Perrault. Competence is a person's, an individual's knowledge of language. So all the complex rules that he has in his mind, his competence is something that he has. The person's actual use of language is called performance. Now I'll make it more clear. it is said that people in Kerala have very good competence in English because they are exposed to English a lot and they have a reasonable competence in English. But in performance, they often fail. We all often say that even though we teach a lot of English, our scholars, our students do not perform well in interviews. The problem is with performance. So performance and competence are two different things. It is Chomsky who first spoke about that. This is a very important information when it comes to actual applied linguistics, when we attempt to teach people language. So very often it is not bringing in new linguistic aspects that is needed. It is activating the existing knowledge that a person has. So the existing knowledge is competence. It is unclear, it is passive, it is there in the person's mind. It is, and the performance is not an accurate indicator of competence. A person who doesn't perform well, I mean, that means who is not able to use language very well, doesn't mean that this person's competence is bad. He might have a rich knowledge of the language which is unconscious and disconnected in his mind. So a person with a high level competence need not have the ability to perform in an equally effective manner. So this is a very important bit of information when we come to teaching English or any language to people. So that is competence, the person's innate unconscious ability to speak or use the language and his actual instances of speech or writing. Chomsky also talked about the universal grammar, what is called universal grammar, which is he theorized that human beings are born with the innate ability to learn and use language. It doesn't mean a child is born with the capability of speaking. It means that the child has the basic software, to use another word, in its mind on which you can write language. So the structuralists believe that people are born, when they are born they have a kind of blank mind. They did not say that, but at least that is how they seem to assume. And language is something that is acquired after a person is born. Chomsky's argument is that a human child is born with the innate ability to learn language. It doesn't mean it is born with the ability to actually speak, but ability to learn language. And depending on which language the child is exposed to, the child will become proficient in that language. So universal grammar is the ability of a person, basic ability of a person to learn language, not any specific language. That has to be decided after the person is born and exposed to different one language or the other. So this innate faculty to learn language is called universal grammar. So this is different from competence. Competence is something that you acquire after you are born, after you are exposed to language quite a lot. You have linguistic competence, and you may or may not perform equally well. That's a different concept. Here, universal grammar is the thing with which we are born. A child is born with innate ability to uh, a child born with this innate ability builds its linguistic competence on a basic frame of language learning that exists in its brain. So its brain is not tabula rasa or a blank thing. Chomsky talked about grammaticality and acceptability, and let us look at what they are. Grammaticality is how a language conforms to the grammatical rules of that language. If it follows the rules of a particular language, then it is grammatical. That's very simple. So a sentence is grammatical if it follows all the grammatical rules of the language. And Chomsky noted that human beings have the ability to understand and produce an infinite number of new sentences in totally new combinations. Every Malayalam speaker, a good Malayalam speaker with some kind of schooling, will be able to know if a wrong Malayalam utterance is heard. So when a wrong sentence is heard, the person will immediately know the sentence is wrong. He or she will also be able to say how that sentence actually should be said. We have that knowledge. That is an intuitive knowledge that we acquire through exposure to the language. We may not be able to explain why, but we will know that utterance, whether that utterance is right or not, how that utterance can be improved, etc. We know. This is the grammar that we actually have in us about the language. So once we have learned a language, we have the grammar of that language inside. That is an unconscious thing without any shape. You may not be able to explain in grammatical terms, but you will know when you see a wrong utterance. That means we have a good grammatical knowledge of every language. So to be able to explain, then you need to have the special vocabulary for that. And that is where a teacher of grammar comes in. Well, let us leave that there and look at this grammaticality here. Grammaticality is related to a person's competence, linguistic competence. But all grammatical sentences need not be acceptable to the users of language. So perfectly grammatical sentences may be produced, like Chomsky's famous example, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. So you have a noun phrase, colorless green ideas. You have a verb phrase, which is sleep furiously. It's all paka, fine, but it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't, our logic immediately says that it doesn't have any meaning. So, acceptability is also important. It is related to the person's performance. So, with our linguistic knowledge, when we come to perform, we need to be conscious about the acceptability of the statements we make. So while all acceptable statements must be grammatical, all grammatical statements or sentences need not be acceptable. So this is another concept of Chomsky, grammaticality and acceptability. The immediate constituent analysis is a way of explaining the structure of sentences. It was introduced earlier by Leonard Bloomfield in 1933. Um, I have just made it very simple here with this diagram. Usually, IC analysis is shown using a tree diagram. It can also be shown in other ways. Here that we have a sentence, we are going to analyze and look at the structure of the sentence. The man repaired a car. So we have divided into two broad sections, the man and repaired a car. In the first section, we have the, which is a determiner, and man, which is a noun. And here, the second part is again divided into two. A car, which is like the man, a determiner, and a noun. And before that, we have a noun in the past tense. So repair and ed. Ed is the suffix showing past tense. So repaired a car. So this is a way in which we break down the immediate constituents of a sentence and to show its structure. We cannot divide it into divide it any further. The man, repair, ed, a car. They are the smallest morphological units to which the sentence can be broken. So this is a way in which immediate constituent analysis, introduced by Leonard Bloomfield, is a way in which we can study the structure of a sentence. But in it we just bring out the structure of a sentence. In phrase structure rules, Chomsky again, he made it more um, it made it clearer using labels. So here we have the same sentence, the man repaired a car. Let's look at it. This is a sentence. The sentence is the man repaired a car. The sentence is divided into a noun phrase and a verb phrase. Repaired a car is the verb phrase. The man is a noun phrase. The verb phrase again has a verb and it also has a noun phrase, which is a car. A is a determiner and car is a noun. The is a determiner and uh, man is a noun. And we can represent it here. Sentence is noun phrase plus verb phrase. Noun phrase, verb phrase. And noun phrase contains here, in this particular context, it contains a determiner and a noun. In another context, it could be another combination. And here the verb phrase, here in this particular sentence, has a verb and a noun phrase. And the noun phrase again has a determiner and a car. This is the way in which the uh, Chomsky went a step further, and improved IC analysis so that you have a clearer description of the phrase structure within a sentence. So this is again a way in which language can be closely studied very scientifically. Phrase structure, PS rules. And we also talk about transformational rules. There is a thing called transformational generative grammar to which we are coming. And the phrase structure rules we have seen, and now we look at transformational rules. Now let's look at the sentence again. The man repaired a car. It's an active sentence. It has a phrase structure here. This is a phrase structure. PS. Noun phrase 1, the man. Verb repaired plus noun phrase 2. And its passive form, again, it has a different phrase structure. Noun phrase 2 with an auxiliary was an auxiliary verb has come in. And repaired, this is past participle. That's why we have said verb en, past participle of the verb. Though in this case both are the same. If it was eat, it would be ate here and eaten here. Well, so a car was repaired. Here you have an auxiliary verb has come in. The past participle of the verb is used. By is a particle has been used. And then you have the noun phrase. But it is noun phrase 1. So you can draw a phrase structure rule and show the transformational rule here by saying NP1 plus V plus NP2, that is this rule, is the same as NP2 plus auxiliary plus past participle of the verb plus by plus noun phrase 1. So this is transformational rules. Which is part of transformational generative grammar. It shows the relationship between sentences that have the same meaning but have a different grammatical form. The attempt is to expose the deep structure of the sentences. So what the phrase structure rules do is to expose the deeper structure of the sentences. So we looked at IC analysis, improved and developed into phrase structure rule. Rule here is different from rules of the traditional grammar. Grammatical rules, that's a different thing. Here it just means the kind of formula that is created. For this kind of formula is called rules here. The rules should not be understood as rigid, hard and fast rules of grammar. Okay. So to put those together, we'll get transformational generative grammar. Chomsky called it generative because his model of grammar attempted to formulate rules for all the correct sentences in a language. So these rules should be able to generate all the this grammar, generative grammar, should be able to create rules for all the correct sentences in a language and only the correct sentences in a language. It should not create like in the deep structure there should not be a problem. It should create all the right and only the correct sentences in a language. So TG grammar or transformational generative grammar. We saw how the rules are generated. We saw how the transformation is done, and transformational generative grammar was developed by Noam Chomsky around the middle of 1950s. Now we live more than something like 70 years after that, and much changes have happened. And in the area of linguistics and grammar, in teaching, learning grammar, immense lot of changes have taken place, particularly in the area of applied linguistics. Here we are looking only at the foundational principles of linguistics. Now, generative grammars do not merely distinguish the grammatical sentences from ungrammatical sentences. It also provides structural description, syntactic analysis, that is, for each of the grammatical sentences. Again, this is transformational generative grammar, adding to it. Active and passive sentences, which we looked at in the slide before the last one, and we brought out the underlying structure or the deep structure. That is the advantage of TG, where the deep structure, um, where the grammar assigns a deep structure and a surface structure to show the relationship of different kinds of sentences. When one kind of sentence is transformed into another shape, it will look different, but it will have the same deeper structure. The notion of deep structure can be very helpful in explaining ambiguous utterances, like flying aeroplanes can be dangerous. So when we classify it, it can be classified in a manner that the deeper structure is brought out. Flying, whether it's the aeroplanes that fly or it is the act of flying that is dangerous, it lies only in the deep structure, and that can be brought out using transformational generative grammar. So this is in brief. Um, the ideas mostly brought forward by Chomsky's contribution. We have looked at it from a very simple manner. Only the basic things we have looked at, but that will be enough to for a foundational uh, knowledge about linguistics. So we looked at traditional approach and structural approach. We looked at structural grammar. We looked at the cognitive approach, where we said that human beings are born with a mechanism to learn language. We looked at deep and surface structures, competence and performance, which is similar to Lang and Parole, and universal grammar, acceptability and grammaticality. We saw how IC analysis is done and how it was advanced into TG, into phrase structure rules, and into transformational generative grammar. Thank you for listening, and we have completed 3 videos on linguistics, which have been the second and the third might have been a bit difficult. I would recommend you to listen to it more than once, and you also look at your textbook so that your understanding will be perfect. In the coming videos, we will be looking at phonetics and aspects of phonetics, vowels of English, consonants of English, suprasegmentals, etc. Thank you again.